About a month ago, Stephen King released his 79th work of fiction in 50 years. That's a lot of books for 50 years of publishing. He debuted with Carrie in 1974. For context, Judas Priest and Kiss also debuted that year. 1974 was the year of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Blazing Saddles. And all these years later, King is still putting out bestsellers. It's amazing to me that Stephen King has sold successfully for 5 decades. Even if his books of late aren't up to his previous standards, you can't take away the sales history from him. Over 400 million copies sold globally. In 2024, Stephen King is back with a story collection called You Like It Darker. But sometimes I wonder if in this stage of his career, King is worried more about maintaining sales history than developing impactful stories. Most of his outings in the last 20 years or so seem to only dilute the pool rather than to fill it up. I would say that of the last 26 books that he's published in the last 20 years, maybe only 9 or 10 of them should have been published. But who the hell am I? The first story of the bunch is Two Talented Bastards, spelled just like that. Okay, it's a 60-page story, and it follows 2 narratives. One of the narratives follows 2 men from Castle Rock County. We're going back to Castle Rock and Harlow and those there in that area. 2 men who lead ordinary lives. They have ordinary talents, and then one day their talents propel them into national recognition. The other narrative follows the son of one of the 2 men, Mark's son, who is talking to a reporter who really wants to get in and talk to Mark about this mysterious phenomena that might have propelled them. She's convinced that there's something that happened that made them so famous, because they both entered fame into middle age, which is uncommon enough, but they're both from the same town. They know each other, and it happened about the same time. So she's convinced that something happened. And as readers, so are we. Okay, so that's the other story. My biggest gripe is that these 2 narratives sound exactly like Stephen King, where one of the narratives is actually an epistolatory letter. It's an epistolatory narrative told through a letter written from Mark to his son. And that letter sounds exactly like Stephen King talking in the other narrative. And I just wish that he had gone to greater lengths to distinguish the writing styles in the letter that the father wrote to the son, so that it doesn't sound like Stephen King. And that's a complaint that I have about a lot of Stephen King books. King puts a lot of writers into his books, which is fine, except for the fact that a lot of the writers, when you get examples of their work within the books, sounds exactly like Stephen King. So is it deliberate author insert, or is it just King's unwillingness or inability to write like somebody else for the sake of his character? I don't know. It's not a huge deal, but it is details like this that I think have prevented Stephen King from ever entering into that realm of truly masterful writing. Also, I'm not certain that Two Talented Bastards was the right story to open up You Like It Darker. Two Talented Bastards is too pastoral for a book called You Like It Darker. It wasn't really dark at all, and to open up a collection that promises darkness was a little disappointing. I will say that the strongest part of the story, even though it wasn't distinguished from King's own writing, was the letter that Mark wrote to his son. Specifically, the passage where they enter the 30-mile wood. It makes me want to go take a walk on the woods right now. And that passage alone about the 30-mile wood was worth reading the entire 60 pages of Two Talented Bastards. The next story is The Fifth Step. It's a short 10-page story. It's the shortest story in this story collection. Now, in Alcoholics Anonymous, the 5th step states that we admitted to God, to oneself, and to one other human being the exact nature of our wrongs. It's a confessional step, but one need not find a priest to confess your sins. Just any old dude on a park bench will do. And that's what the story is. 2 men on a park bench. One of the men is confessing his sins to the other. It's kind of a set him up and knock him down story with a bit of a twist. Kind of a typical twist for short stories, but not a kind of typical twist for Stephen King short stories. I should have seen the ending coming, but I didn't. The next story is Willie the Weirdo, and this is another very short story. It's only 12 pages long. Now, I haven't really gone exploring the reviews yet. We're going to do that a little bit later in this video, but I have heard that from some people, they say that Willie the Weirdo was the worst story. Some people thought that they didn't understand it, that it didn't make sense. Willie is called the Weirdo, Willie the Weirdo, and when Stephen King calls somebody weird, he absolutely delivers. Willie is a super weird kid, and I don't want to spoil the nature of his weirdness. That's actually the best part of the story, not really the thing that happens at the end. I will say, though, because of the thing that happens at the end, it opens up so many possibilities that I thought this story could have been an entire novel or at least a novella itself. But we didn't get that. And again, Stephen King doesn't ask me for my opinions before he publishes his books. But yeah, I think that instead of a twist ending, it would have been cool if there was a twist beginning to a much longer story. The next story is the longest story. It's a full-length novella, maybe even a short novel. It's 157 pages. Definitely by far the longest story in the bunch. And in Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream, Danny Coughlin has a bad dream. And Danny's dream leads him to discover a corpse. She's the victim of a murder, an obvious murder. And because Danny discovered this corpse from clues in his dream, he feels like nobody's going to believe him. So he attempts to report this crime anonymously. However, two Kansas detectives are onto him. They find him out really easily because he's an amateur at this. He's not a professional criminal. So he doesn't think like a criminal. So even reporting a crime anonymously, he still manages to mess that up. So they're not buying, the detectives are not buying this whole story that he discovered this body in a dream, which I think was a mistake for him to tell them anyway. He just as easily could have said, I was out for a drive and I stopped to take a leak and I found this body. Why he went through the whole rigmarole of trying to convince two detectives that he had a dream, I don't know. But they're obviously not buying it. They think he is the murderer, posing as a good Samaritan, which is the obvious conclusion to a situation like this. So you can sympathize with the detectives. My biggest complaint about this story is not that Danny decides to tell the detectives that he had this dream, but that the story is told from Danny's perspective at all. Danny is not an interesting character. He is an average dude. He's a young man. He's a janitor at the local high school. He's got a heart of gold. He's a good guy. A couple of small demons in his past, but nothing like to really make him interesting. Just enough to make him feel like a really average, normal person. Okay? But the detectives in this story, Jalbert and Davis, are so much more interesting than Danny that anytime they're on the page, I'm more interested in them. So this story, I really think, should have been told from Jalbert and Davis's perspective and kind of go back and forth between those two. Where this story should have been about two detectives who get this case that seems like a slam dunk, like an obvious slam dunk case. But they can't find any evidence to support the theory that Danny is obviously the murderer. And then the lengths that they will go to and the lengths that they will not go to create some evidence to secure a conviction. Jalbert and Davis start off agreeing with each other, and then they start getting further and further apart. That dynamic was the only great part of this book, specifically Jalbert's end. Jalbert, he's a little mentally ill, okay? And his obsession with pinning Danny for this crime exacerbates his mental illness to a delightful effect, at least to the reader, right? Jalbert's suffering, but we, the reader, are loving it, okay? That's the best part. Anytime Stephen King zooms in on Jalbert alone, those are the best scenes of the entire book. But out of 157 pages, it probably accounts for a total of 10 of those pages. If the whole book had been told from his perspective, shifting to his partner Davis's perspective, I would have absolutely loved this story. Even if things played out exactly as they do in the story that we got, just shifted from a different point of view. That would have been terrific. Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream, the story, is a really great example of how I think King has missed a step over the years. He's not really sure what his best ideas are anymore. He chose in this story to focus on Danny and his dream. The dream is not the interesting thing here. It is not the prevailing point of interest in this story. The dream was the catalyst, but it's not the thing that kept me reading. The thing that kept me reading, the most interesting point, was Jalbert and Davis's dynamic. And King chose not to focus in on that as much as I think he probably should have. But again, Stephen King doesn't ask me for my opinions when he writes these books. So, okay, the next story is Finn, a 20-page story, and far and away the worst story of this bunch. This came out a few years ago, and I listened to it on the Scribed app, which is now the Ever and app. And I hated it then, and I reread it this time because I thought, well, maybe I just wasn't in the mood. And I hated it again when I read it in this collection. It's a shit story. It's a case of mistaken identity. It's all set up, no payoff. The protagonist is even more boring than Danny Coughlin. He's a real nothing burger. I hated it. So, moving on. The next story is On Slide Inn Road. Slide Inn is like a hotel. It's a defunct hotel. And there's 3 generations of a family. They're driving to go see the grandfather's sister who's ailing. Okay. Grandfather decides he's going to direct the family to take a shortcut. His son is driving. His son is really annoyed. He's the father of the 2 young children sitting in the back with grandfather, blah, 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 blah. It's a family story, family dynamic. But at the heart, it's sort of a fantasy story. But it's not the kind of fantasy story with dragons and magic. It's the kind of thing that you fantasize about. Where what would happen if you're out in the middle of nowhere and you get yourself into a lot of trouble, right? So you come across somebody who is trouble. What if they try to get the best of you, but you turn the tables and you get the best of them? It's that kind of fantasy story. The grandfather being the Clint Eastwood style here. I think Stephen King was thinking of Clint Eastwood's roles in Gran Torino and The Mule in this one. And he kind of combined those 2 characters from those 2 movies into this story. And it is a pretty good story. The people who get their comeuppance in a couple of different ways. And you're left feeling pretty satisfied. I was. However, Stephen King follows up that pretty good story with another nothing burger. The next story is Red Screen, and this is actually tied for the shortest story. This is also 10 pages long. Thankfully, it's very short. Like Willie the Weirdo, Red Screen feels like this is the beginning of a much larger story, and I think I probably would have liked it if it had gone a little deeper. It's one of the rare instances where I think King didn't write enough. 10 pages, he probably wrote it in one day, and he's like, that's enough. I'm just going to throw this in a collection of short stories instead of write this whole novel. Obviously, I don't know that, but that's the impression that I get. Red Screen feels like it could have been the opening, maybe prologue or first chapter of a longer book called The New Adventures of the Body Snatchers. And even though it's only 10 pages long, you know what the twist of the story is going to be on page 3. So you've read 3 pages and you already know how this very short story is going to end. So I just feel like, okay, wrap it up now, wrap it up. I know where this is going. And I was right. There's no surprises. It wasn't terrible, okay? It was not a terrible story. The premise is interesting enough, but it's not new. And in the end, Red Screen is a very forgettable story. And I would have left this one on the cutting room floor. All right, next up is The Turbulence Expert. This is an example of a perfectly satisfactory story. There's nothing here that's outstandingly good or devastatingly bad. It treads the middle path. It's a good short story. It's the kind of story that you could give to a student of writing and say, this is a great example of how to write a short story without it being something that is totally mind-blowing. Average good writers can write stories like this, and they would find that these stories are successful. While I'm reading stories like The Turbulence Expert, I'm like, yeah, okay, it's fine, but like I feel like I should be reading something else at this point. And I feel like somebody as well written as Stephen King should be writing stories a little bit better than this. I know that's kind of a harsh criticism because I enjoyed the story, but now I'm talking shit. But I really do expect more out of a writer like Stephen King than average. All right, next up is a story called Laurie. Who is Laurie? The main character of this story is Lloyd. He's an old man grieving the loss of his wife. His wife's name is Marion. Lloyd's sister, Beth, is tired of seeing Lloyd wallowing in self-pity and not taking care of himself, so she gets him a therapy dog named Laurie. So anyway, this is largely a story, a wholesome story about a therapy animal, except that there's a brutal alligator attack in the middle. And I thought the tonal shift from the wholesome therapy dog story to the alligator attack was not executed very well. I thought it was sort of I got a little bit of whiplash there. Had King gone a little harder in the paint with the alligator attack and completely undone the wholesome nature of the story, just flipped the whole thing on its head completely and really went darker in this story like he promised us he was going to, I would have liked this a lot more. Let me tell you this. A couple years ago, I had an encounter, a very close encounter with an alligator at nighttime. Okay? And that left me pretty terrified of alligators. Now, fortunately, where I live, there's nothing more harmful than maybe a coyote here and there. But this is a terrific cover. This is a, let me pull this whole thing up. This is a terrific book cover, okay? I really like this cover. And when I saw that King put an alligator at sunset on his book cover and promised us that he was going to go darker than he's gone before, I was really excited about that. Until I got to the story where the alligator attacks, and while that's the best part of the story, he kind of cut himself short and kind of like distanced himself from going really dark, which I just don't understand. He could have taken that a lot further without even going into like gross out, body horror or whatever. It could have been truly terrifying, especially for me. But it wasn't, and it just sort of left me feeling, oh, well, okay, that happened. It's sort of weird. Moving on. The next story is Rattlesnakes, and Vic Trenton from Cujo reappears in this ghost story. Vic is decades on from his son's death, and he is still grieving, which adds to King's overall theme in You Like It Darker of aging with grief. But it doesn't add anything to Cujo lore. And in fact, Rattlesnakes is more closely related to Doomakey than it is to Cujo. But this doesn't add anything to the Doomakey lore either, because the nature of the horror is different than it was in Doomakey. And it's different than it was in Cujo. So I'm not sure why he decided to incorporate Cujo and Doomakey into the story Rattlesnakes. Except that in, Needful Things, I wrote a note here. It's, Needful Things, The Body, The Dark Half, and Pet Cemetery, they all mention Cujo. And Doomakey is littered with Dark Tower references. And this might have been King's way of bringing Cujo into the path of the beam, which seems like a very Stephen King kind of thing to do, to link Cujo and all these other stories that mention Cujo as a real dog. So now we know that they're all in the same world that Dark Tower exists in, sort of that same universe. Okay, that's the only reason that I can think of that he did this, because it doesn't really matter. It could have been anybody who was grieving the loss of a son, and it could have taken place really anywhere in the United States. So it didn't have to take place in the Keys, and it didn't have to star Vic Trenton, but it did. And none of that really bothers me. It just sort of boggled me. I actually like this story a lot. Rattlesnakes feels like the most classic King out of all of the stories in this collection. Pitting parents and children against each other is a classic horror device that King has employed many, many times in his books. And the twist on that horror device in Rattlesnakes was done really well. And I just so happen to have read this story on Father's Day. Now my son I'm not being haunted by my son. He's still among the living, thank God. He got me a great gift for Father's Day. Hold on a second. Now I lived in Alaska for 16 years, and I'm a great big fan of J.R.R. Tolkien. And my son got me this map. Here, you can see it here. This is a really cool map of Alaska done up in Tolkien's Middle-earth style. It's very cool. So, thanks, buddy. Okay, only 2 stories left. The next one is The Dreamers. And The Dreamers is, bar none, my very favorite story in this whole collection. It is a very, very good piece of cosmic horror, yet just like Willie the Weirdo and some of the other stories in this collection, I feel like The Dreamers could have been the impetus for a much larger, more in-depth story. At least a novella-length story. This was a terrific concept. And this concept feels like it's so much bigger than the 34 pages that King devoted to it. Honestly, I really would have liked to see The Dreamers fleshed out into a whole novel, but I don't think he's ever going to do that. But this premise definitely could carry the weight of an entire novel, even one of King's big ones, but I don't want to give anything away here. Suffice it to say, it's my favorite story of the bunch. Supremely inventive, I thought. All right, the last story is The Answer Man, which is a various and meandering kind of story. It is something that we've all fantasized about, just like Slide In Road. This is the kind of thing that we sometimes fantasize about, driving down the road ourselves, and we're just thinking, what if I knew everything? Or what if I knew parts of my future, if not everything? And this story kind of plays out that what if scenario. And there are 3 kind of mini stories set within this memoir-esque tale here. And though they're mere vignettes, they really carry the whole story. There's the war story, the leukemia story, and then the story about the burned woman. And those 3 stories were absolutely terrific. These stories illuminate the fact that just because you know the future doesn't mean you know what's going to happen. You know what I mean? And I really liked that. And once again, this story kind of brings home King's overarching theme for You Like It Darker as aging with grief. Probably the most obvious example of that in this entire collection. Now, The Answer Man isn't going to get you real excited, and it's not going to scare you. It just sort of gets you sort of like nodding inwardly with understanding. It's a good story. I just feel like it was the wrong story to close the collection out. I didn't think he opened with the right story, and I don't think he closed with the right story. But that's neither here nor there. He doesn't ask my opinion. Okay, so that's all 12 stories summed up. But what we're going to do now is we're going to go over to Goodreads. Like I said at the top, this book's been out for about a month. We're going to go down the list of reviews, and we're going to look at 5-star, 4-star, 3-star, 2-star, and 1-star reviews for You Like It Darker. And we're going to see what other people have to say about this. All right, so let's pull up You Like It Darker on Goodreads here. Let's just maximize the screen so you can see it. All right, so there's the basic screen. It looks like it's got an average rating of 4.39 at this point. But it's probably the constant readers who are getting in on the first wave. And here's the distribution right here. You can see that 52% of the ratings are 5 stars. That's pretty good. And it's way down to less than 1% is 1 star. So his ratings are looking pretty good on this book, but let's break it down. All right. So this first one from Trisha, I would read his shopping lists. All right, so then here you've got Rebecca's reviews, and she's broken it down into all 12 stories and each rating that she would give to each one of these stories. It's kind of a cool way to do that. It's kind of interesting that she did that. Now, off camera, I added all this up and averaged it, and it comes out to an average of 4.2 stars, so she's rounding up to the 5, and she says she's going to give, she's going to rate 5 stars overall because of how much she enjoyed her favorites here. But she's only rated 2 of the stories 5 stars. The Dreamers and Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream. Kind of interesting that the whole collection would be rated 5 stars, with just 2 of the 12 being rated 5 stars here. But who am I? So 5-star ratings are. Let me try to find a 5-star rating that has something critical to say. So 5-star ratings aren't always the most informative. It's a lot of stands in here. Let's see if I can find a 5-star rating that says a little bit more than, oh my god. All right, so Bill says, I've been a Stephen King fan for a long, long time. And although I haven't enjoyed much of his recent work, I found You Like It Darker to be one of the best things he's written in years. So here's a guy who hasn't enjoyed a lot of what King has written in the last couple of years, but he liked this collection. And so I think a lot of people tend to like Stephen King's short fiction a lot more than his long fiction. Different fans, right? All Stephen King fans are different. So Stephen King fans tend to like him for completely different reasons. And so there are definitely some who like his triple deckers, and it looks like Bill likes his shorter fiction probably. So Ginger says, I don't think there's a bad plot in the collection. And then she says, for me, some plots worked better than others. 5 stars. Nina says at the end of her review, whether you end up loving every single story in this collection or simply find some of them to be lacking, what I know for certain is that there will be something in You Like It Darker that will stick with you and leave a lasting and haunting impression, as King's writing always does. What is going to stick with me? I think The Dreamers is going to stick with me. That was the only one that I thought really went real dark. And it was just very briefly. That's not true. Rattlesnakes is a little dark in a mild Stephen King way. Oh, gosh. Okay. Corey, King is my guy. All right. That said, his recent output has not been his greatest work. Okay, so all of his criticism changes with the release of You Like It Darker, remaining insanely readable, tense, and entertaining. There is simply nothing bad here. It's all good. Okay, so I think we've got the gist from the 5-star reviews. So let's go to a 4-star and see if we can't find a little bit more critique. So Chantel says, I love this book. Yes, it's a little slow in places and some stories don't shine as brightly as others, but overall it's a captivating read that keeps you hooked. My only gripe, I wish it was darker. So yeah, it seems like I'm not the only one who thinks that we would have liked it darker. All right, Russ says, as is the case with most short story collections, this to me is a mixed bag, with mostly good to excellent stories. Finn was by far the worst, luckily one of the shortest, and I didn't get the point of it at all. Man, all right, Russ says, many of the stories, like Two Talented Bastards, the Turbulence Expert and Answer Man, were whimsical rather than dark. Okay? Fine stories, but not dark. Darker, Mr. King, please. Finding a theme here. I'm finding a theme already. And these are in the good reviews. All right, so then was it Insamincy says, although the relish of sinking into a good old tome by King is undeniable for me, there's no doubt his short stories are a strong suit. That being said, nothing will ever scare me like King's stories in my teenage years. Not even King himself. Yeah, so slightly melancholic. Yeah, there's a couple of, yeah, Two Talented Bastards and the Answer Man are melancholic stories for sure. Ian the Reader says this is the best work King has published in some time, and there's a breakdown of his ratings on all these stories here. He thought Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream, The Fifth Step, and The Answer Man were the top stories. Interesting selection there. All right, so let's go on to the 3-star reviews now. I've spent enough time here. So there are 736 3-star reviews. This is just 9% of all of the reviews. All right, Bill says, a decent collection of King's short fiction, a few standouts, Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream, The Dreamer's Fifth Step on Slide and Road. Others not so much. It's interesting because some people really hated The Fifth Step and some people really liked it. His stories are usually a little more reliant on characters and the outcome of the events, and like how does it resolve without it being a twist. So his short stories are really like very condensed novels. So the Fifth Step was a little bit different in that way. Nope, no darkness here. Willie the Weirdo is getting very mixed reviews from people. I'm not reading to you everything that I'm finding here, but there's some people who really didn't like Willie the Weirdo. Danny Coughlin's Bad Dreams, one of the best so far, full of tension, mystery, and dread. This one sucks you in from the beginning, wonder where it's going to lead, and you know it's going to take you someplace dark. A few COVID mentions throughout seem pointless, except to feed King obsession. Stephen King is obsessed with COVID. He's obsessed with masks. There's a lot of talk about COVID and masks in Holly, and COVID and masking comes up a little bit in You Like It Darker, but it's like he just can't let go. A lot of these stories are set during COVID, but there's no really good reason for it. None of the stories' plots hinge on lockdowns or paranoia or fear or actually people dying from COVID. None of the stories have anything to do with COVID except that there's just people dealing with it. But in 2024, we've really moved on. And it would be nice if King could move on and just stop talking about it now. Finn, a story with a kid with bad luck. Not sure what the point of this one. So nobody knows what the point of Finn was, but at least it's short. That is like the second time if someone said at least it's short. All right, so Flo says, this collection proves that Stephen King can't really write short stories. The quality varies a lot, but the best ones have the length of short novellas. Ooh. Oh, Oliver Clark. I watch his YouTube channel. He's Criminally. All these reviews, great. If you haven't watched any of Oliver Clark's reviews, he goes by Criminally on YouTube. He posts a lot, so he does crime, pulp, horror, and that kind of thing. All right, so Irene says, darker is a subjective term, and this book shows the author's definition is not what I was thinking when I pre-ordered this book. Even a 100-watt bulb is darker than a 50-watt bulb, but you would not need a flashlight to see in it. Awesome. Awesome, awesome, awesome. I love that. Even a 100-watt bulb is darker than a 50-watt bulb, but you would not need a flashlight to see in it. That's awesome. Irene, kudos. I'm going to like this review. That is, just for that line alone, that's great. Yeah, it is darker than a spotlight. Perfect. All right, Jason says this collection is pretty forgettable. Ari says, I love 2 longer stories, but found the most to be forgettable. Shady Side Library says, I hate to say it, but this book was a bit of a drag. Most of the stories were in one ear and out the other. If you don't already know, Stephen King is my favorite writer of all time. I didn't know that, Daisy, but now I do. So let's go to the 2-star reviews now. All right, Amy says DNF. All right, so Scott says his worst collection of shorts, Rattlesnakes, was good. Austin says DNF. None of them are dark or even horror, as the title might imply. They are. Some of them are horror. Some of them are horror, but yeah, it's not dark. All right, Mandy says, I hate to say it, but his more recent works are just not good. She liked Danny Coughlin, but 1 of 12 being really engaging isn't enough. Not when it's King. Not when it's anybody. If you only like 1 out of 12 stories from any book that you're reading, that's not enough. Cassidy says, I think I need to retire my love for King. Ooh, that hurts, Mr. King, to hear your constant readers say that. I've enjoyed a fair amount of his newer books, but they've been slowly slipping off my must-read shelf. Cecilia says not his best. Now, again, this is a very low percentage of the readers here. So Cecilia says not his best. Some of these stories read like they're unfinished. Diana says, in my opinion, if the name King wasn't attached to this short story anthology, it would have never been published. Well, it's not an anthology, Diana. It's a collection, and there's a difference. But yeah, if this wasn't Stephen King, if this was written by somebody else, they might have had a hard time getting this published. A fair to middling collection of stories. The Lovecraftian Dreamers was the best of the bunch. Nina says, I wish I loved anything as much as King loves mentioning the virus that shall not be named. It's in almost every story. Holly was unreadable, and this one just got on my nerves. So damn annoying. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Okay, I don't know what that means. All right, so that was the end of the 2-star reviews. Okay, so then we're going to go to the 1-star. There's only 33 1-star reviews. This accounts for less than 1% of all of the reviews. So bear that in mind. This is less than 1% of people who have read this book on Goodreads who found that this is a 1-star book. But this is where the comments are going to get good, I think. Nina says, the only dark thing about these stories is how bad they are. Goosebumps is darker. Joanna says, COVID is mentioned on every 3rd page, and lately King has been screwing up his old novels with pointless sequels, so I'm guessing there will soon be a sequel to The Stand with survivors struggling with coronavirus. Oh my God, that's funny. Juliana says this book should be called You Like It Lighter. This really sums up a lot of why people are still reading Stephen King, I think. Juliana says, I hope Stephen King's next book will be better. He's one of my favorite authors, but this book here doesn't deliver on what it promises. I think that a lot of us are feeling that way, whether we're giving it 1 stars or 3 star or even 4 stars. Like, the overwhelming sentiment here is that Stephen King has lost his touch. He's lost his ability to scare, and his books, but we all just keep hoping that the next one is going to be great. Okay, so EBKK says, if fans can rate it 5 stars without having even read the thing, I can give it 1. Teresa says, You Like It Boring should be the title. The worst compilations of stories ever. Okay, so welcome back to this side of things. Let's see, where were we? Okay, so if it had been up to me, I would have cut Finn and Red Screen from this collection. Just cut them right off. This book is already 500 pages long. These are pretty short stories. It still leaves us with 10 stories and 470 pages if this is the order. Now, I would have started it with On Slide In Road, which is a great bit of fun. It's a great way it would have been a great way to open the collection. And I would have ended with the strongest outing, which is The Dreamers. You got to end on a high note, right? Leave them wanting more. Also, if this was my collection, I would have rewritten The Dreamers and Willie the Weirdo and expanded them out to much, much longer stories, at least novella length. Their premises would have easily carried them out to 100 pages or so. I would have rewritten Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream to be told from the perspective of the 2 detectives, like I said earlier. Let's see, what else would I have changed? Lori and Rattlesnakes would have been much, much darker, upending their wholesomeness. And On Slide In Road, the Turbulence Expert and the Answer Man would have taken on much sharper edges. And finally, I would have gotten rid of the title, You Like It Darker. I would have gone instead with one of the phrases used in the book, something like, what did I write down here? In equal measure, or the last thing you see. You could have even called it Rattlesnakes, with a picture of an alligator on the cover. I don't know. Anything. I don't like the title You Like It Darker because it's a message, it's a statement directed directly at the reader. It feels like a movie tagline. And if you look at the back cover, it says You Like It Darker question mark. Fine, so do I. So it's like an interrogative, it's like a challenging question to the reader. But he doesn't deliver on that at all. And I think you saw that borne out in a lot of the comments that we just saw. And I agree with that. This is not a dark collection, and it doesn't have to be dark. He can write wholesome books, slice of life stories if he wants, and he's pretty good at that. His writing style is very comfortable for me. Every time I pick up one of his books, the only reason I'm still really reading them, even though I just don't tend to like his books as much as I used to, the reason I keep reading him is because it's very comfortable. His writing style has a very strong nostalgia complement to it. And I just feel like I'm hanging out with a friend. People call it guilty pleasure reading. I don't believe in guilty pleasures. You just read what you want, don't feel guilt about it. But it is my comfort zone. As the book stands, I was talking about changing the title of the book. If without making any of my proposed changes, the book published exactly as it is, a better title would be It's Getting Old. That's got a double meaning there if you see what I did. Anyway, as it stands, You Like It Darker is a mixed bag. It's comfortable reading though. Overall, it's fine, but I enjoy reading King's books. I just don't expect them to be very good anymore. And that's all I have to say about that.